Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy Summer 2019. In this video, we'll be going over, in our book, Introduction to World Philosophy, a Multicultural Reader. In this video, we're going over John Locke. John Locke from an essay concerning human understanding. So, relating this back to the exam questions for exam 1, part A, this will be addressing question number 3. So the questions are a little bit out of order. We've already gone over question 4 and question 5. So we're going back, and question 3 asks, which do you prefer, Descartes' definition of a self or Locke's? Why? Remember to explain the basic idea of both of their theories. So we went over Descartes' definition of a self in the previous video. In this one, we're going over Locke, and we'll compare the two. So, in a very brief nutshell for Descartes, what is a self? A thinking thing. I think, therefore I am. Cognito ergo sum. Cognito is I think, ergo sum, therefore I am. That's his definition of a self. He was saying even if some kind of a omnipotent evil genius was forcing you to think everything you're thinking, so that even the laws of mathematics are fictions, they don't really make sense, you just think they do, under the influence of this manipulator. Even if that's the case, there's still one thing we can be certain of, that we exist. Why? Because we have to exist in order to be deceived. And to be deceived is to be forced to think something that's not true, but you're still thinking. If you're thinking, you exist. That's the one thing Descartes says we can trust. He was trying to doubt everything, so that if there's even the slightest doubt of it, he'll just dismiss it as absolutely false. And he came to one conclusion. There's only one thing that we can be certain of, and that's that we exist because we think. So John Locke is agreeing with that basic idea that yes, the idea of a self definitely involves thinking, but it's more than just thinking, it's memory. It's memory of the things you did in the past, plus the act of thinking in the present, and specifically thinking about the fact that you're thinking, self-reflection. So animals, it's presumed, don't think about the fact that they're thinking. They think, but they don't turn that consciousness back at itself. Whereas John Locke is saying humans do, and then if you add that moment of self-reflection, add to it all your memories, plus if it's possible, anything you can know about the future actions you might do, whatever memory you have or foreshadowing, that constitutes the self. So he separates the idea of a self from the idea of a human, or his word is man. So actually in this video we'll be going over 2 of the part A questions for exam 1. So question 3, comparing Descartes and Locke, and also question 6, why does John Locke distinguish between the terms person, man, and substance? How are those definitions related to his comments about punishing people? How are they related to his comments about the possibility of reincarnation? So, person, man, and substance. He says, if you look on page 276, on the right-hand column, paragraph 8, so he numbers the paragraphs. Idea of identity suited to the idea it is applied to. It is not, therefore, unity of substance that comprehends all sorts of identity, or will determine it in every case, but to conceive and judge of it aright, we must consider what idea the word it is applied to stands for. It being one thing to be the same substance, another the same man, and a third the same person, if person, man, and substance are 3 names standing for 3 different ideas. Okay, so substance. Substance is either material or spiritual. So this relates to Descartes. This is flesh, this is material substance. Descartes would define it as extended in space. Substance is extended in space. Spiritual substance, or your soul, your thinking mind, for Descartes, is a substance that thinks but has no extension in space. So, we saw in the previous video, Princess Elizabeth from Bohemia, she asked Descartes, well, if the soul has no extension in space, how does it interact with the body? If you think finger move up and down, where's the contact point between your unextended soul and this finger that's extended in space? It's the mind-body problem. Descartes doesn't provide any adequate answer to it. I forgot to mention in the previous video, though I will mention it now, that do we have any knowledge of a substance without any extension in space according to modern science? Yes, although it is a controversial point. It's the beginning point of the entire universe. The Big Bang supposedly came from a point of zero volume and infinite density. So no extension in space, and yet it has infinite, it contains all space and time, and yet it is itself not extended in space and time. So if we identify that gravitational singularity from which light itself is born, if we identify that with the soul, or Atman as the Hindus called it, or the idea of the good according to Plato, then it begins to present a solution to the mind-body problem. How do the mind and body interact if the soul has no extension in space? Well, if the soul is the gravitational singularity that gave birth to the universe, and if furthermore, as I've explained in previous videos, the soul exists at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light from our perspective on Earth, and if the past, present, and future are recorded eternally at each point of that horizon of the cosmos, then that definition of a soul as a point that's not extended in space, surrounded by a sphere that's also not extended in space. It's a two-dimensional sphere with no extension in space because it is the place where space and time stop. So this is, you're not responsible for this on the exam, but this does provide an answer to how an immaterial substance with no extension in space can affect a material body extended in space. And the answer would be, well, if the soul is one with the singularity and horizon of the cosmos, and if all three-dimensional material forms are radiating in from that horizon on fundamental threads, which string theory says, and which Carl Jung's near-death experience says, there's the interaction. Mind and body are interwoven in the singularity and the horizon of the cosmos, and it's more like a dream. What we call material reality is three-dimensional forms evolving over time. It's more like a dream that's being projected from a memory bank where the past, present, and future are conserved. That becomes important, that option, when you're going over what Locke is saying and what David Hume is going to say. So going back to the text here, person, man, and substance. Substance, there's two types: material, extended in space, but it doesn't think, according to Descartes, and immaterial substance, not extended in space, but it thinks. And it furthermore thinks about the fact that it's thinking. So what Locke is going to say is that a man is just a continuously living human form. So that it's not dependent upon consciousness. The person is the consciousness, he'll say. The self is your awareness of yourself plus your memories. But the human being is that awareness combined with a living body. And even if the awareness goes, you're still a human being. Someone who's brain dead is still considered a human being. That person still has the rights of a human being. So what's the relation between person and a human? That he addresses that question, and he says, is a person necessarily attached to an immaterial substance like Descartes says? And Locke will say maybe or maybe not. We can't be sure, and he addresses potential problems with that theory. So for the exam question number 3, which you prefer, Descartes' definition of a self or Locke's, that idea that you're going to focus on is, do you prefer Descartes' definition of a self as an unextended substance that thinks, or do you prefer Locke's idea of a self as awareness of itself plus memory, and he leaves it open to question whether or not that consciousness is attached to an immaterial substance or only to a material substance? He says, I don't know, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of pragmatic reality. Let's just define a self as what we know it is, which is your own knowledge of yourself plus your memories. So getting back into this, on paragraph 9, page 276, he says, same man. So he's defining person, man, and substance. At this point, he's going to describe man, by which he means human being. So he says, an animal is a living organized body, and consequently the same animal, as we have observed, is the same continued life communicated to different particles of matter as they happen successively to be united to that organized living body. So a living body is constantly changing the material particles of which it's made, like a tree. It's from an acorn into a big tree. There might not be one single atom in the grown tree that was present in the acorn, but we consider it one continuous tree because it's a living form of organized matter. And even though the matter's coming in and going out, whatever new particles come in follow the same pattern of organization, which we know now is due to the influence of DNA molecules, which I'm no expert on, but at any rate, that is what constitutes a human being, just the continued human material form and with one organizing life force. That's different from what he'll call a person, which he discusses on paragraph 11 on page 277, the left-hand column. He says, personal identity. This being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for, which I think is. So here's his long definition with a lot of semicolons, and I'll go over it once and then come back and go over it again. So this is what he says a person is: a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing, in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking and, as it seems to me, essential to it, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. That's a controversial point. So let's go back over this again. So here's what personal identity is: a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself in different times and places. Here I am, I'm a thinking thing. Oh, I know I'm a thinking thing. That's reflection. Take two mirrors and face them into each other, and then you have infinity. When I was a kid, I remember my mother would take me wherever she went shopping, because if you're a little kid, you've got to go wherever your mom goes. And then in the department store, they'd have these big mirror doors, and you could line them up, and then if you look, it would look like it went on to infinity, smaller and smaller versions of yourself. So it just seems to me that that's what separates human consciousness from the other animals' consciousnesses. And that's an important point. Descartes would say the animals don't have consciousness. They're just machines that seem as if they have consciousness. But someone like Plato or the Hindus would say, no, they have the same soul as a human, but their bodies are incapable of directing that consciousness back on itself to achieve self-consciousness. But that's the first anchor of personal identity for Locke. Awareness of your own awareness. And then he'll extend on to that all of your memories. So continuing here on paragraph 11 on page 277. Oh yeah, before I continue though, he says it's impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. Well, he's not aware of an unconscious mind. That wasn't part of the lexicon of Western philosophy yet. Leibniz was really the first one, I believe, to use the word unconscious mind, whatever the German or Latin translation is. But here Locke is saying, if you think, you know you think. If you perceive something, you know you perceive it. But now we're pretty certain there's a lot of things that you can be aware of without consciously, cognizing that fact. If cognizing is a word, I don't think it is. But at any rate, if you're driving home and you're daydreaming, next thing you know, you're in front of your house. How did I get here? Well, you were driving and you were paying attention on some subliminal level. And then, so the existence of an unconscious mind is an important point that he doesn't address. Or if he addresses it, he says, I'm just not, at this point, we don't know enough about the mind. So, but continuing here, he says, for since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, in this alone consists personal identity, i.e., the sameness of a rational being. And as far as this consciousness can extend backwards to any past actions or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. It is the same self now it was then, and it is by the same self with this present one that now reflects on it that that action was done. So, if you can remember doing an action, then you're the same person who did it back then. But there's a problem. What if you forget? So that's exactly what he addresses in the next paragraph, paragraph 12. Consciousness makes personal identity. But it is further inquired whether it be the same identical substance. This few would think they had reason to doubt of, if these perceptions, with their consciousness, always remained present in the mind, whereby the same thinking thing would be always consciously present and, as would be thought, evidently the same to itself. But that which seems to make the difficulty is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of all of our past actions before our eyes in one view. All right, so there's the problem. If we had all of the whole train of all of our past actions before our eyes in one view, then there'd be little reason to doubt that our self is identical with some immaterial substance, a soul. But the problem is we do forget. We did things 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and we totally forgot. And then you might 20 years later remember. Were you not the same self who did that action in the interim when you forgot? Therein lay the problem, he says, with automatically identifying the self with the same identical substance. Because there's change. Your memory is changing, and therefore if it's attached to some unchanging substance, how do you account for that? So again, a few minutes ago, I pointed out this whole idea of current cosmology in academia. If you go to study, most students go to study string theory if they study physics, because string theory combines the two previous major theories, general relativity, the theory of gravity by Einstein, and quantum mechanics. So the point for here is that according to string theory, which unites these two, the past, present, and future of the whole universe, the memory of the whole universe is recorded at each point of the horizon of the cosmos and the central singularity from which it flares forth. So that would be the immaterial substance that constitutes a self, according to Locke's demands, that the whole train of all our past actions be before our eyes in one view. And we do all know about at least one example of this kind of an event. And all I have to do is say, my whole life flashed before my eyes. We've all heard that expression, because that's a near-death experience. Either when your heart stops and or like some people have recorded, when they're almost killed, like a bomb might land right next to them, but then it doesn't explode. But in the interim, people recall, I vividly recalled, as if living it again, every point in my entire life in an instant. And that is people say that again and again who recover from near-death experiences. When they're in the hospital, their heart stops, they feel their consciousness rises out of their body, they're hurtling through space towards this point of light, through a dark tunnel. All of those things are consistent with current cosmology, specifically this idea of hurtling through space and through a dark tunnel. According to general relativity, if you were traveling at the speed of light, all of the light in the entire universe would be condensed in a single point at the end of a dark tunnel from your perspective. And that single point would contain all space and time. That's the gravitational singularity, which exists at each point of this encompassing horizon, which is the memory bank of the universe. It's just that very demanding criteria for a self that Locke requires and that we're going to see David Hume require. Is it just a coincidence that that is provided for by 21st century cosmology? Really, it was 20th century cosmology. It's just something to keep in mind while we're going over this. So, but he's saying the fact that we do forget things calls into question whether or not our consciousness is combined to an immaterial substance that never changes, which is what Rene Descartes said in the Meditations. It actually, we never had him say that directly in the selection that we read, although Princess Elizabeth, who's writing a letter to Descartes, does point out the places where he says that the soul is an unextended immaterial substance. And then she says, okay, if that's the case, how does it have contact with the body that is extended in space? So I'm going over this several times so that you'll feel comfortable with the exam question. So continuing here on page 277, he says that, all right, so he repeats that basic idea again and again. I will point on the right-hand column where he talks about the future. It's not only the past memories, but if you know something you'll do in the future, that's you too. So the bottom of the right-hand column on page 277. He says, for it is by the consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is self to itself now, and so will be the same self as far as the same consciousness can extend to actions past or to come. All right, and would be by distance of time or change of substance no more two persons than a man be two men by wearing other clothes today than he did yesterday, with a long or short sleep between. The same consciousness uniting those distant actions into the same person, whatever substance contributed to their production. So this is also going to bring up the idea of reincarnation. So question number 6, part A of exam 1. Why does John Locke distinguish between the terms person, man, and substance? How are those definitions related to his comments about punishing people? How are they related to his comments on the possibility of reincarnation? So regarding punishing people, which you can read about on pages 280 through 282, if you are your memories of yourself, then you're not guilty of a crime that you can't remember committing. The same man, the same human being might have done it. The same physical form that your consciousness now inhabits might have committed a crime, but if you can't remember doing it, and if the definition of a self is being aware of yourself now plus your memories, then the person didn't commit the crime. So, and that's the temporary insanity plea. He points that out, that even law in his day, that's the 17th century, notices that. In certain situations, people are outside of themselves. So that's how it relates to the punishing people instant. And he talks about the resurrection of the dead on the last day, according to the Bible, in the last book of the Bible, Revelations or the Apocalypse. He says on that day, everyone will recall all that they've done, and that you'll be acquitted or punished according to your memory of what you've done. So it doesn't matter exactly what kind of form you're reincarnated in or resurrected in, it's the consciousness that counts. You could be having the same consciousness transported from one material body to another, although you wouldn't be the same man, because a man or a woman is the physical form. You'd be the same person, if, for example, consciousness is attached to a soul, an unextended immaterial substance, and placed from your body to the body of a frog. If the frog had all of your memories and your own self-awareness, then you're the same person inside the frog that you were inside the human form, but you're not the same human. And it relates to reincarnation that way. He's saying, I don't know if people are reincarnated or not, but if one consciousness is transferred from one body in one age to another in another age, so long as that consciousness is the same, it's the same person. But if there's a soul, he points out, that transmigrates from one body to another, say from Socrates in the past to the mayor of Queensborough in the future, which is the example he points out, if the mayor of Queensborough has no consciousness of anything Socrates did, then it's not the same person. It's the same immaterial substance, it's the same soul, but it's not the same person. So, for example, what is substance? A CD, a compact disc, or whatever recording medium you use is a material substance. I can record a movie onto one CD, erase it, and record another movie. So the information, let's say a person is the movie, or a song, or whatever it is you're recording. That information is, that memory is the person. And the compact disc is the substance. And in this instance, you can have this information transferred from one substance to another, but it would be the same information, it would be the same person, or the same movie. So that's just one example. And that's why he's got these three different definitions: person, man, and substance. A man or a woman, a human being, is a material substance, a living material form, enduring through time. Even though all of the atomic particles are different from moment to moment, it's a continued life force. Whereas a person is the consciousness. That's the essential difference there. And is a person annexed to an immaterial substance? He's saying maybe, but there's a lot of problems, and that's where he's addressing the issue of reincarnation. If you look on page 278 in paragraph 14, he says, whether the same immaterial substance remaining, there can be two persons. He goes, as to the second part of the question, whether the same immaterial substance remaining, there can be two distinct persons, may be wholly stripped of all the... all right, so I'm just skipping around here. He's saying, if you're wholly stripped of all the consciousness of its past existence and lose it beyond the power of ever retrieving it again, and so, as it were, beginning a new account from a new period, have a consciousness that cannot reach beyond this new state, all those who hold pre-existence are evidently of this mind, since they allow the soul to have no remaining consciousness of what it did in that pre-existent state. So the personal identity, reaching no further than consciousness reaches, a pre-existent spirit, not having continued so many ages in a state of silence, must needs make different persons. And then he gives the example of the Christian Platonist who thought he was Socrates. And then later he spills the beans and he says it was the mayor of Queensboro. So if you don't remember, so the same soul's been reincarnating. You were in Socrates, you were in Nestor at the siege of Troy, you were in whoever you want to think of in the past. It's the same soul, granted, but if there's no memory of those different lives, each life is a different person. If, however, you can remember all those different lives, then it's the same person. That's the bottom line for him. And then he has all sorts of different scenarios. One of them I put in the side margins on page 281, paragraph 23. He says, could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night? So that movie Fight Club, there was a guy who by day he was one person, and then he would go to sleep and then another person would come out. The actor was Brad Pitt, and that person started these fight clubs all over the place where they would fight, you know, in basements. And it was supposed to be secret. There's one rule of Fight Club. There is no Fight Club. So at any rate, at the ending scene, these two people in the one body are fighting. And it's the video camera shows the guy punching himself and throwing himself downstairs. So is that possible? And John Locke says, yeah, you can have two consciousnesses in one body, theoretically, if the definition of a self is awareness of itself plus memories. That's all that counts. And so then re-emphasizing the idea about punishing people. If you look on page, actually page 280, paragraph 18 on the left-hand column. Persons, not substances, the objects of reward and punishment. In this, personal identity is founded all the right and justice of reward and punishment. Happiness and misery being that for which everyone is concerned. Okay, so on the right-hand column, near the bottom, on paragraph 19, he says, but if it be possible for the same man to have distinct, incommunicable consciousnesses at different times, it is past doubt the same man would at different times make different persons, which we see in the sense of mankind in the solemnest declaration of their opinions, human laws not punishing the madman for the sober man's actions, nor the sober man for what the madman did, thereby making them two persons, which is somewhat explained by our way of speaking in English when we say such a one is not himself or is beside himself. And then again, he talks about that on page 282, paragraph 26, personal forensic term. So he says, person, as I take it, is the name for this self. Wherever a man finds what he calls himself, there, I think, another may say is the same person. It is a forensic term appropriating actions and their merit, and so belongs only to intelligent agents capable of a law and happiness and misery. And then he mentions on the right-hand column there, the great day. So he says, and therefore, conformable to this, the apostle tells us that at the great day, when everyone shall receive according to his doings, the secrets of all hearts shall be laid open. So the great day refers to the day of resurrection, when all of the dead rise from the grave in whatever form they do, that the secrets of their hearts will be laid open. All of their actions will be in front of their consciousnesses at one instant, according to St. Augustine's interpretation of that verse, which, again, that in one instant all of your memories are present simultaneously. That's what John Locke says you would have to have a self being attached to an unchanging immaterial substance. Memories would not be able to be forgotten and remembered again. They'd have to, all of them, the whole train of your consciousness. If you look again on page 277, paragraph 12, on the right-hand column up at the top, well, it's starting at the bottom there on the left-hand column. He says, but it is further inquired whether it be the same identical substance. This few would think they had reason to doubt if these perceptions with their consciousness always remained present in the mind, uninterrupted by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives, he's saying, wherein we have the whole train of all our past actions before our eyes in one view. Since we do forget, we're probably, it becomes doubtful that we are connected to one identical substance. Maybe we are, but then we have to address that issue of doubting. So again, according to the reincarnation theories, people do remember their whole lives in one instant when their consciousness leaves their body. And I've read other texts that say, if you believe in reincarnation, you can finally get out of the cycle of reincarnation, or samsara, according to the Hindus. When you finally realize you're a soul and not a body, then you don't have to come back. And at that final leaving, you remember all of your past lives simultaneously. And that is what supposedly happened to Buddha when Buddha had his enlightenment moment. He remembered all of his previous lives. So what John Locke is saying you need is consistent with the theory of reincarnation, although he doesn't realize that, because he's saying that if you believe in reincarnation, then you say that you forget your past lives. We saw that on page 278, right-hand column, paragraph 14 in the middle. All those who hold pre-existence are evidently of this mind, since they allow the soul to have no remaining consciousness of what it did in that pre-existent state. Yes, that's true, but in between lives, you do remember your whole life simultaneously. And again, at the end of your entire trajectory of reincarnations, you supposedly remember all of your lives simultaneously, specifically at the horizon of the cosmos, which the Hindus called the ether or akasha, and which Plato also refers to in the Phaedrus that we read. In between births, he says you go out, and it's possible to go out to the outermost vault of heaven and perceive all the absolute ideas, the eternal idea of beauty and goodness and justice and every other one. Okay, so I think we've covered it. Questions 3 and 6 of Part A for Exam 1. Which do you prefer, Descartes' definition of a self or Locke's? Remember to explain both theories. And why does John Locke distinguish between the terms person, man, and substance? How is that related to his comments about punishing people and reincarnation? We've gone over all of those issues, and the next videos will be about David Hume.